Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting episode of the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live from the fabulously fluoridated capital of Auckland, New Zealand, the island chains nation in the sunny slave South Pacific. Not only fluoridated, it's also Fukushima irradiated, which is good for the economy, because now everybody can snap up a part-time job as an incandescent light bulb. Now, my very special guest today, I will in fact have to ask her to introduce herself. Welcome to the show, darling.
Hi, I'm Marie-Therese Hall, Charles Hall's wife, and we just returned from our Australian tour. We're still suffering from jet lag, but we're already looking forward to planning another trip, and so sorry that we couldn't include New Zealand in our venture. Charles had an R&R to Sydney from Vietnam in 1968, and he always wanted to bring me to Australia, but when we got married in 69, he didn't even have money to buy me a ring. And so when 2013 rolled around and he told me he'd completed the last book in the Millennial Hospitality series, I said, it's time to celebrate. You name the place and we're going. And then I made the happy mistake of sending an email to a woman who'd contacted us, perhaps 7 years ago when she and her husband were in the States. Little did I know she was well known all over Australia. And what I'd suggested in the email was that she invite some friends in for a potluck and we would visit with them. And she said, we can do better than that. And so she instigated venues for us in Sydney, Brisbane, the Sunshine Coast, and Adelaide, turning our second honeymoon into a rock star tour. So we just had a wonderful time. The Australians were so hospitable. And shall I tell you about when Charles told me about the extraterrestrials?
By all means. I mean, in fact,
Okay.
a brief introduction, of yourselves and what you do in general would be great as well.
Well, Charles waited until a couple months after we were married in early 1970. And at that time, he said that these extraterrestrials had come into his barracks at night. And he said, what do you think? And I said, hey, I never thought about whether extraterrestrials existed or not, and I really don't care. I just hope that if I ever met one, I would behave in a manner that was a credit to the human race. Well, we spent the next 35 plus years raising a family. I have 6 children. And when Charles was 58, he came to the end of a contract and was unemployed. Actually, the unemployment lasted 18 months because when you're 58, you can have a fabulous interview, but they might hire the person who's 48 or 38. Anyway, he was about a month into this unemployment, and I walked into the computer room and he shut the screen real fast. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm working on a book. And I said, you write a book? I can't even get you to write 3 sentences to your mother. This I've got to see. So he printed out 2 chapters. He'd apparently been working on memoirs for our grandchildren in his spare time for over 18 years and hadn't told me about it. I read for a few minutes and I came back and I said, we have to publish this. And he said, I don't think so. Even if you don't say anything bad about somebody, they can sue you. And I said, so do what authors do. Put a disclaimer in the front of the book and change the names of the people and, pretend it's fiction. And he said, nah, the Air Force never told me I couldn't talk about these things. But on the other hand, they haven't been exactly forthcoming during the last 40 years. I said, so change the place names too. Well, he still was very negative about this. And finally I said, Charles, you're unemployed. If the men in black come to the front door, you should go with them. It's free room and board. And then he started laughing and he said, you're right. What do we have to lose? Well, a lot of these files were on a dead computer out in the garage, and took some coaxing to get them up, and we had to reformat them. I had him take the profanity out because we all know how men talk, but the stories were so good that I wanted sixth graders to be able to read them. And then I also took out all the slang because I thought that people all over the world would read these. Some people for whom English, excuse me, was a second language. And indeed, that has happened. And I felt that if the books were written in good English, it would be easier for them to read. So anyway, we sent the first book off to the publisher, and I thought that was it. And I had given the manuscript to a friend of mine who's an author, and she finished reading it, and she said, well, it's not exactly my cup of tea, but she said, he should write more. It's really good. And I said, well, he had to swear to me that everything was true and happened to him because I was going to be spending some of my inheritance to publish this. And while I am not opposed to science fiction or fantasy, it isn't really my thing. And so anyway, I came home and I told Charles that Stephanie thought this was good. He should write more. And he said, oh, well, I have more files. And I have stories that I haven't written down. And I said, what? And he said, well, I was with them for over 2 years on a daily basis. So anyway, the series grew, and it's now 5 books. And anyway, well, two things I want to tell you about that before I turn the mic over to Charles. A former NASA engineer flew out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we live, and took us out to dinner. And he said, I always believed everything that was in Charles' books, because when I was at NASA and doing very well, they came to me one day and they said, if you'd like to be in the real space program, we need to move you to Nevada, to Nellis Air Force Base. That's just north of Las Vegas. And his wife and daughter didn't want to leave their extended family. So he left NASA and started his own business, and still has a high clearance and does work for the military, I assume, all over. Anyway, at the time he visited us, his proposal was that he fly us back east to where he lived, and he'd put us up in a nice hotel and show us around and pay us money to just have dinner with his family and friends, which we did. It took about 2 months to set up. And in the meantime, he actually ended up at Indian Springs, which is now Creech Air Force Base. The name was changed in July of 2005. I don't think it had anything to do with the fact that Charles' books had been out, but it was a ribbon cutting ceremony at the end of this project. And he said there were no lower ranking military there, just generals and high ranking officers. And he was standing next to a general that was actually a friend of his. And he said, I was just thinking, I'd drive up the road a mile or two, and I won't get out of the car and just look at the terrain. Would that be okay? And he said his friend said, bad idea. You might not come back alive. And then just as quickly, he said, I'm so glad you could be here today for this. Anyway, he said, if anything, he thought Charles underplayed the terror and the secrecy and so forth in his books. The other nice thing that I wanted to mention is that while Australia was on Charles' list, the only place on my list was Italy and Rome. And we did go there in, I believe it was late 2005. And I took the books that we had at the time as a presentation for Pope Benedict. And I included a letter because I wanted the Pope to know that everything in the book was true and happened to Charles. Now, I didn't feel like the Pope had to have our books. I just wanted him to have them. Anyway, it was a very nice surprise for us upon our return, maybe a month later, to receive a thank you letter from the Secretary of the Vatican State, not just thanking us for the books, but also thanking us for the letter that accompanied the books. And I think it's interesting to note that I believe it was in 2008 of November that the Vatican had a confab about extraterrestrial life. And in fact, there was a statement in Le Observatore Romano, which is the Vatican newspaper, saying that it's perfectly fine to believe in extraterrestrial life. And these are all things that you can Google. they're on the internet. The Vatican, in fact, has an observatory on Mount Graham in the state of Arizona here in the United States, in addition to the observatory that they have outside of Rome. Well, anyway, I think that's enough of an introduction. I will turn the rest of the program over to Charles. Okay?
All right, thank you very much.
Unless you have a question.
Oh, well, let's get right into it by all means. We have limited time frames. All right, so we got
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I hope I don't cough too much.
I hope I don't either.
I want to thank you for having us, and it's a pleasure to be on your program.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's nice that you guys have, taken some time out of your jet-lagged, sleepless schedule to be here with us. So why don't you tell us about your experiences, Charles?
Well, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and in 1964 I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. After much ado, I ended up as a weather observer, and the Pentagon wanted me stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, which is on the northeast side of Las Vegas, Nevada. I'd hardly arrived there in March of 1965 when I was told, and I was an enlisted man, I had only 2 stripes. Now I have 2 master's degrees thanks to my wife. I'm helping me through college. But I did my services as an enlisted man. And I was hardly there, and the Pentagon wanted me to relieve the duty weather observer at Indian Springs, even though I had not yet completed my on-the-job training. And so when I went up there in late April, early May of 1965, I was to relieve the guy who was there before me. I discovered that I went up to the Indian Springs gunnery ranges, which are like 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, and they're the back door to Area 51. And I discovered that that at the north end of Indian Springs Valley, the mountains that are like 40, 45 miles north of the town of Indian Springs, that the Air Force had a base up in the mountains for extraterrestrials. The base had a double perimeter. It was inside a security area, which was inside a security area, which was inside the Area 51 boundary, which was inside another security area. So they were inside security areas. It had a double perimeter. The outer perimeter was maintained by the human guards. And there was some up in those mountains, as you can see in my website. And there
Tell
was
them what your website is, so people can.
It's millennialhospitality.com, spelled the way it sounds. And if you Google Charles Hall and UFO and words like that, it'll come up in the Google. And what I found is the inner perimeter was maintained by the alien guards. And what the base was a spaceport for the extraterrestrials that I've named the tall white extraterrestrials. The American Air Force generals referred to them, and I quote, as our white friends. Their skin was as white as a piece of paper, and they're described in my book. What they use the base for is the same thing that Sydney uses its airport for. Their deep spacecraft would arrive on schedule, and then they'd be in port for a couple of weeks while they were repaired and refurbished, and then they would stand off to deep space again. So there was a permanent crew that ran a permanent crew of aliens that ran the spaceport. And then there were the usual passengers and stuff who would be in port for a couple of weeks waiting for their spacecraft to be repaired and refueled. And as the duty weather observer, my job, there were 4 gunnery ranges in the valley below, in Indian Springs Valley and over in Range 1 and over in Dogbone Lake Valley and so on. And as the duty weather observer, I was in charge of all those weather shacks, and it was my duty to get up at like 3 in the morning and drive out to the ranges and take the weather reports.
Well, hold on, Charles. We'll just have to leave it there until we come back from break in about 3 to 4 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Hall, and his website is millennialhospitality.com if you want more information. We'll be right back after the break at thevinnieeastwoodshow.com. Welcome back to the Vinnie Eastwood Show. It is listener supported entirely, ladies and gentlemen, so your donations and monthly donations in the form of subscriptions are very much appreciated. Indeed, it is what allows for all this to be made possible, as you, the very lovely, generous and fabulous and so wonderful people who listen to this show, get so many emails and positive comments and things like that. It just keeps my heart filled with joy. And yesterday I went out to a protest, Charles, and had this guy tell me, why don't you get a job? And I said, well, bro, I'm a talk radio show host. I've put more Kiwi activists on air than anybody else in New Zealand history. He's like, oh yeah, and I think that really helps society, doesn't it? It's like, oh, okay, mate, I'm wrong. Maybe I should be a slave like you. But anyway, welcome back, Charles, and I'd like you to just continue where you left off, if you can remember exactly where that was.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. When I was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada in 1965, and I was there for 2 years before I was shipped to Vietnam in 1967, I spent more than 2 years out on the gunnery ranges interacting with the extraterrestrials who were out there. The base at the north end of Indian Springs Valley was for the extraterrestrials I call the tall whites. They're flesh and blood creatures like we are. They have men, women, and children like we do. But during that time, I also personally was in front of 2 other types. One is the Roswell Greys, and one is the ones that I call the Norwegians with 24 teeth. In this interview, because this is a limited interview, I'll concentrate on the tall whites, where I spent most of the time. The tall whites are so much like us that the shocking thing was that you could talk to them the same way you would as though they were human. When meeting them was intensely terrifying because of fear of the unknown, and it took me more than 6 months to get over my fear of encountering them in my barracks and out in out in the ranges at night. Indian Springs, the base at Indian Springs was a very small base. It was an auxiliary field maintained by Nellis. Sometimes there were only 7 or 8 airmen on the base. At other times there might just be me and the cook. And I was always bunking alone. And there were several barracks of World War II style. And so every time when I would meet them as they came in at night, at first I thought I was sleepwalking. Then I thought maybe it was my angels coming to tell me I was going to die. Then I thought maybe I was nuts. And it took me 6 months to get over the terror, but lots of times the extraterrestrials did not come by themselves. Lots of times the American Air Force generals would be showing a group of them around and introducing them to the Earth, along with extraterrestrial generals. And during that time, I got to see their scout craft, their deep space craft, and the propulsion systems. And since I have a master's degree in nuclear physics, I've copyrighted what I call Hall photon theory. I believe Einstein was wrong about relativity, and I believe I know why. And in the appendix of books 3 and books 4, I have copies of Hall photon theory. that describes why I believe he was wrong. I think there are more force fields than what Einstein knew about. Book 5 I've dedicated to my experiences among the Roswell Grays, which occurred on two separate TDYs to a different area of the desert where the Grays are. The Tall Whites and the U.S. Air Force work very closely together. The U.S. Air Force provides them with anything they want, including the base and protection and food, replacement parts, all that stuff, in return for technology transfer. The Tall White extraterrestrials share technology with us if it's to their advantage. Some things they do not share because they don't see where there is an advantage to them. One of those is the propulsion system for the deep spacecraft. But other things like radios, fiber optics, and so on, there's an advantage for them to share that with us, and so they share a great deal. The scout craft that the Tall Whites use when they're here on Earth are built using American parts. And one of the ways technology transfer occurs is the U.S. Air Force says, would you like some replacement parts for your scout craft? They come in different sizes. They're made and assembled here on this Earth and at the main base. And by so doing, that's another way the U.S. gains access to alien technology, by building the replacement parts. I just, in my books, I'm only trying to share how it felt to live those days on a day-by-day basis. I'm not trying to convince the American government. I'm not trying to convince the American government to do anything it doesn't otherwise want to do. But the point of my books is that those years were very emotional years for me, including the time I spent in Vietnam, where I was in the Delta with the South Vietnamese, and my friend Kenneth E. Baker willingly gave his life to keep me alive. And I'm trying to share those emotions. I'm trying to capture those emotions and share them with the reader. So writing the books was a very emotional experience. I was never part of any project, and I was, as a weather observer, nothing I did was ever classified because that was what the 12 white generals and the American generals agreed would happen. And so all of that is explained in my books, in my 5 books, and writing them was a very emotional time for me. I could go on for hours, but I want to make sure that I've answered any questions that you or your readers may want.
Now, you said your friend Kenneth Baker died so that you could live. Could you explain that?
Yes, it's described in the last part of Book 3. After I left Nellis to go to Vietnam in May of 1967, I was stationed in the Delta at Ben Tui Air Base outside Cantot, and Kenneth Baker was stationed there with me, along with a handful of Americans. And I describe in Book 3 how there came a day where he was certain that his guardian angels had told him the time and place that he was going to die, and had given him the choice that either he would die and I would come home, or I would die and he would come home, and had given him the power to choose. And he chose himself, that he would die and I would come home. And that's described in the books, in Book 3. One of the points I'm trying to make in my series is the difference between talking to extraterrestrials, who are just flesh and blood creatures, and those times when I've felt that I was talking to my guardian angels, or those times when I've seen religious experiences that involve God, religion, and the angels. I'm Roman Catholic, my wife is too. Both of us have always been very religious. So some of the episodes described in my books, which are all happened to me, do not actually involve extraterrestrials, but involve religious experiences, such as how it felt to be in the tower at Ben Tui and have my friend Kenneth Baker come and say, well, his angels said it was okay if he told me because he was going to die to keep me alive. And so the books, so while a lot of the material in the books is about extraterrestrials, there's a significant amount that is about those religious experiences when I felt that my angels were there with me. There's a great deal of humor in the books as well. But during that time frame, I felt that I experienced every emotion that a human can experience, from abject failure to terror to being, fear of the unknown, being shot at. I survived 37 separate communist attacks, and along with numerous other, close encounters, etc.
So you're very familiar with the feeling of fear, apprehension, anxiety, things of that nature. We just had Anzac Day here in New Zealand to kind of remember the dead and soldiers and things of that nature. And something occurred to me is that people who've seen their friends die generally don't want to talk about it because it brings it all up again. Is that the same for you?
That's definitely true. However, after he died for a week or so, I didn't care if I lived or died. I was so depressed. But then it seemed, as I described in my book 3, a few days after he had died, I was coming back from the chow hall, and I stopped to say a prayer for his soul, and it felt like he was standing there beside or behind me, saying, "I'm in heaven." And for a few minutes I could feel, or it appeared that I could feel the joy he felt as he was entering heaven. So, and I decided that he had died to keep me alive, to be the person I was when I came to Vietnam, and that it was therefore my duty to be that person, because that's what he had died to protect. And so I felt it was my duty to get back to where I could laugh and joke and be myself, because that's why he gave his life. And that if I stayed depressed for a long time, if I let it get to me, that would mean that he had died for nothing. And so I felt it was my duty to him and to God and to my religion to pray for him and to go to church for him and to get back to where I could talk about it. And that's why the last half of book 3 contains those experiences, those Vietnam experiences, because I felt, and I tried especially hard to make sure they were word for word true, and that they captured how it felt to be a soldier and to be living those days. I felt that was my duty to him.
Now, you also said there's a bit of humour in the book. I was wondering if we could switch gears for a moment, and if you could recant it. Was there anything that amusing that happened on that base?
There was a great deal of amusing that happened on the base, and a simple example. In book 1, I describe the night that I came back from Nellis with a 2.5-ton truck full of supplies, and how the extraterrestrials and the generals were out there waiting for me on range 1. I'm sorry, out at range 3, and how I became really, in the course of unloading the truck, I was really exhausted, and how I was. And I thought I was hallucinating because I was so tired. And so so there were 3 jokes I told them. The jokes are not related in the book, but one of the jokes, which I didn't think was very funny, but an example of humor, was the following joke. I said, the joke goes like this. I said, I went into the tavern at Cactus Springs, and there was a white lady horse tending bar. And I was awestruck. I just stood there and stared at it, and the white lady horse came over and said, "What's the matter, Charlie? Haven't you ever seen a horse tend bar before?" And I said, "It's not that. I didn't think the cow was going to sell the place." Now, I didn't think it was that funny.
I want to read a passage from your book.
We're rolling in laughter at that one.
This is just an example of a passage that I thought was funny. I opened the door and went in. Sitting there in a soft chair in a darkened room was a pleasant man, probably in his early 40s. He was neatly dressed, wearing a nice three-piece business suit with a narrow necktie. The bulge under his left armpit betrayed the gun he was carrying in a shoulder holster. From the size of the bulge, I concluded the gun must be an unusually large caliber, and the bulges in the pocket of his suit jacket looked suspiciously like extra ammunition clips. Unusual tools for a neurosurgeon, I thought to myself. You see, he walks you through the things that happened to him, and he was there for an interview, but they told him he was going to see the neurosurgeon. And so while he wasn't briefed on the fact that there were extraterrestrials out there or anything, he was just being led along. He was 19 years old, and this was before ET or anything. And so all of it was kind of, something he had to figure out as he went through it. And that's what I really like about the books, because he doesn't try to prove the existence of extraterrestrials. In 15 years, everybody will know about it anyway. And you can't write a book proving the existence of God if you don't have an audience open to it.
Well, that's
So
right. Unfortunately, we come into break as well. We'll be
Yes.
right back, ladies and gentlemen, with Charles Hall. Back in a few minutes. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live from New Zealand. My very special guest, Charles Hall, sharing with us his extraterrestrial experiences. Welcome back, sir. Can we ask as well, considering the emotional impact of these sorts of experiences on you, have you questioned, your sanity or your place in the world after seeing these things that not many people get to see?
No, but for the first 6 months, I thought I was hallucinating, or I thought that it was me. But even though logically every time they would come, it was very obvious that they were real. For example, they might come and open up the locks on my weather shack, something that you couldn't ever do mentally, of course, and you could prove that they'd open the locks and you could see footprints in the sand and so on. After about 6 months, I decided that they were real, no matter, and that Einstein had to be wrong about relativity. And so, that day is described in book 2, in the chapter entitled The Journey, the day that I finally stopped wondering if it was me, and I decided there was nothing the matter with me. That day, during that time, I had gone to the neurosurgeon, to the medical people, and so on, and they said, there's nothing the matter with you. And as I describe in the chapter, The Journey, I'd gone into Nellis to have my eyes examined, and I was trying to tell the doctor there what I'd been seeing out in the desert. And he was the doctor he was one of the doctors at Nellis, and he knew there was stuff out in the desert, but he didn't have a need to know what it was. And he became very angry with me, and he was screaming at me. And since he was a bird colonel and I was had only 3 stripes at the time, or I had only 2 stripes at the time, naturally I was quite afraid of being screamed at by a bird colonel. And he was saying, don't you understand? There's nothing the matter with you. Whatever you're seeing out there is real. That's why we sent you. You're the only one that can take it. Before me, according to my log books, I estimated that they had sent something like 41 different weather observers before me in the 7 years before I got there. And every one of them had been compromised. Some had been burned. Some had been given Section 8 discharges because they'd become so terrified. Many had become so afraid of the ranges, or most, that they would not actually take the weather reports. They would just hide in the barracks or hide in the chow hall and make up the weather. Now, the Pentagon wanted the weatherman to actually go out and take the weather report, because what they were trying to do is to establish more lines of communication between humans and extraterrestrials, because the extraterrestrials, the new ones, when they come here, are more afraid of us than we are of them. And one day I asked the one lady whose CIA name was the teacher, why that was, and she explained it to me. She said, "Well, this is our planet. They're very frail. We understand this planet. We're built for it. We can, if we get stung by a bee, we laugh it off. If they get stung by a bee, they have to go for immediate medical attention, or they'll die. And so there was a lot more about this planet for them to be afraid of than for us. And those are the kinds of things that I describe in my books, and how I discovered that. No one ever came to tell me anything or to brief me on anything or to show me anything. I had to figure it out for myself. What they would do is the women and kids would come, because I'm a weatherman with pretty colored balloons, and the kids wanted to play where I was, their kids, and watch the balloons float in the air. And of course, they would come with guards, and they would come armed. And on the other hand, I also had catalogs like Sears for department stores, and their ladies would like to come and shop for dresses and other things, and do all the normal things that humans would do in the same situation. And it took me a while to figure out that they really were just like us. Hollywood gives us so much baggage about what extraterrestrials are supposed to be like, or what they're all supposed to be old and wise and care about the whales or whatever. And it took a long time to realize that God made them and God made us, and that we were remarkably alike. We both love our kids. They would come and explain that they loved their children more than human mothers love human children. And it was the biggest shocks was that God did the same thing on two different planets.
Well, indeed, how did this affect your religious beliefs, knowing that there were extraterrestrials? I mean, of course, you now know that the Vatican has been, if you believe in extraterrestrials, that's fine.
Seeing how they loved one another, how they loved each other's kids, how they loved their kids and how they loved each other and so on, convinced me that God is love. And so it made my belief in God stronger, because as I described, like in book 4, the day that I was out at range 3, and this extraterrestrial brother and sister came, and they were both equivalent to a human, say like 19, and they both loved each other, brother and sister style, so much that either one would have died to keep the other alive. And either one would have, done whatever. And it was very sobering, because when I looked at them, I did not feel as though I were looking at two extraterrestrials who were with white skin, who were otherwise human looking, with silver hair and so on. I felt like I was looking at the handiwork of God, seeing how they loved each other. When the extraterrestrials would come around, it was very common for the adults, especially if they were ladies, to explain the family relationships if there were any to be explained. For example, one night a teacher came and explained to me that the person who was standing guard on the control tower was the son of her mother's sister. And they would be very precise about how they were all related. If there were relationships between them, they would do that just out of love for one another. When you saw them playing with their kids or doing things, it was very sobering to see that God had created love even among the extraterrestrials. The same was true for the Greys. The Greys loved one another also, the Grey mothers and the Grey children. So you were always looking at family relationships, and so it made my religious belief stronger. The thing that shocked me was that seeing that Einstein was so completely wrong about relativity, their scout craft, their deep spacecraft used extra force fields that Einstein didn't know about, but he should have, because they're just naturally occurring, like electricity, like magnetism. Well, there's just more of them, see? And seeing how wrong Einstein was about relativity was a huge shock for me. Yeah.
Well, did it give you any kind of crisis of faith, or is it just more like you saw them fitting in with every other species created by God in your eyes?
I never had a crisis of faith. it was so obvious when they came that because they came as family groups, men, women, and children, that it was obvious that that's how God thinks. Now the gray adults cannot breathe our air without a breathing device, but the gray children and the gray teenagers are able to. The gray breathing device looks like a surgical mask. If you didn't know better, when you met an adult gray, you would think you were talking to a medical doctor, but really they're just, that's just their breathing device. So it was more common to see the gray teenagers and the gray children without the gray parents there because of the technical difficulties the gray parents had. But when you did see the gray parents with the gray teenagers and the gray children, it was obvious that they also loved one another the same way the whites loved one another. And the Norwegians with 24 teeth, they're so much like us that if you're not a dentist, you can't tell the difference.
Right. And in terms of your personal experience and how it's really affected your life, you've decided now in the later years of your life to go around and expose the truth about this. Have you experienced any backlash as a result?
Not really. In my books, I am not trying to prove that extraterrestrials are real. I'm trying to capture how I felt to encounter them, and on a day-by-day basis. The books are written without foreshadowing. I tried to capture how it felt to live those days, never knowing what was going to happen on the next day, and if a person doesn't have to believe in extraterrestrials to enjoy the books. And I'm not trying to prove they're real, because as my books show, there were many nights when I was out there and the extraterrestrials were standing right there in front of me. And I myself was still trying to think of some way that this could be happening other than they're real and they came here. And so if a person reads my books or says, gee, I've read your books and I don't think extraterrestrials are real, I understand, because I've been there and done that.
All right, Charles. Well, thank you so much for your time today. What little you have to give is very much appreciated. Your website, again, millennialhospitality.com. Ladies and gentlemen, you can purchase Charles' books and have a look at any other materials that he has on there. Other than that, Charles, again, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a tremendous pleasure to be in your show. Mm-hmm. And, I could talk. I was out there for 2 years, so I could talk for 2 years.
All right. Well, we're definitely going to have to schedule you to come on again within a next month or so.
Maybe he's not in. Maybe after he's recovered from jet lag. We really aren't up to par yet.
All right. I'll see you next year then. All right. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again sometime. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show. Next hour, we're coming up with another guest. Stay tuned. Don't you go anywhere. And if you are keen on some archives, go to thevinnieeastwoodshow.com. Plenty of previously recorded shows are there for your listening pleasure as well. Back in a minute.